Thank you for joining us today. My name is Johannes Blankenbach and I work for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this event on behalf of all the co-organizers, which are the European Responsible Investment Network, ERIN, Frank Bolt, Global Witness, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, and Business and Human Rights Resource Center. This session is part of a broader conference, ERIN's annual European Responsible Investment Conference, which for the first time takes place as an online event due to the pandemic. ERIN is a European civil society network to build a movement for sustainable finance. And we're very grateful to ERIN for the opportunity to be part of this conference and of this platform. And we are also very grateful for the kind support from GIZ for this session. The idea for this session actually emerged from an ERIN working group on mandatory due diligence, of which several of us co-organizers are part of. And as the title of this session says, the purpose of this meeting is really to look at linkages between the sustainable finance, corporate disclosure, and mandatory due diligence agendas at EU level. And we will approach this topic, or better say, a cluster of topics in two panels. So the first one focuses on existing and potential synergies in EU policy and legislation on responsible business conduct. And then the second panel will address investor due diligence responsibilities and leverage under such emerging framework. We will also hear closing remarks from Andreas Jacobs from the German Permanent Representation to the EU in Brussels, before my colleague Mauricio Lazala will then end the session and bid you all farewell. Our distinguished speakers will all be introduced in greater detail during the session and during the panels by our equally distinguished moderators. And before I hand over to the first moderator, Margaret, just two brief points of housekeeping from my side. First of all, due to the size of that group, those of you who are not panelists will only be able to ask questions via the chat. But we really ask you to make use of that opportunity. And please use the Zoom chat, so the chat that is part of the Zoom window, not the one on the conference platform, although I think they are interlinked. But please use the Zoom chat. And although it's a full agenda, we really want to have time for Q&A and bring in your questions. And then second housekeeping point, the session will be recorded and it should be available on this conference platform soon after the session. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to Margaret Wachenfeld, moderator of the first session. Margaret is the managing director of Themis Research, as well as a senior research fellow at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And she also sits on the board of directors of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, CHRB, along with many other affiliations. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, good. Thanks, Johannes. I am just going to introduce the panel. This is the panel that's on the quest to find the one ring that binds them all. We're looking at synergies and gaps across a range of EU legislation that's important in turning the Green Deal and the Sustainable Finance Action Plan into reality. And I think we'll find that those policy documents do in fact bind them all. And I think we should not absolutely underestimate the importance of clear policy signals. But we're actually going to get to that next layer down, where legislation is turning those policy ambitions into reality. And we're going to be looking across the different legislative tools and incentives and disincentives that are built into those regulatory frameworks, whether it's clarifying duties and whether corporate duties on directors. We may get to investor duties that are currently a bit missing in the framework. Processes to identify adverse impacts through the due diligence legislation and the incentives and disincentives that are created when you add liability to that. and the role of mandatory disclosure in all of that. So to bring all this together, I'm very pleased that we have a panel of experts from very different perspectives who are going to answer our key question, which is, how do we better connect the agendas of sustainable finance, corporate disclosure, and mandatory due diligence, as Johannes highlighted? What are the synergies and what are the gaps? So I'm going to start off with turning over to Filip Gregor. Filip is head of the responsible company section at Frank Bold, which is a purpose-driven law firm. And I'm assuming and sure that everybody on this call also knows about the excellent work that the Alliance for Corporate Transparency has done, that Frank Bold has started. The Alliance has looked at disclosure under the EU non-financial reporting directive across 1,000 EU companies. And is really very important analysis to add to this discussion. He's also on the steering board of the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, ECCJ, and that is the ECCJ is looking at bringing legal frameworks for corporate accountability at the EU level. So I'll turn it over to Filip for 10 minutes, please. Filip, thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. I hope you can hear me. And if you can, then I'll just get to it. So I'll try to give you an extremely brief overview of the European Commission's initiatives currently, and the problems that they are meant to address in this space, and how they all fit together conceptually. I'll try to stay clear of details, as this will be something that the speakers will address. And as Margaret said, it's important to know that all of them are framed by the European Green Deal and the related sustainable finance strategy. Just a quick recap, the objectives of the Green Deal are that there are no net emissions of greenhouse gas gases by 2050, that the economic growth is decoupled from resource use, and that no person and no place is left behind. And if I can paraphrase the objectives of the sustainable finance strategy, it is to ensure proper allocation of capital to allow all of this, and also to address the systemic risks in the financial system. So that's the constitution for all that we are discussing today. There are a couple of initiatives that the European Commission has already turned into legislation or is planning to. So on the investor side, this concerns the disclosure regulation, the taxonomy for sustainable activities, although that is still under development in many aspects. And there's a number of other measures concerning the new sustainable finance strategy that are not yet, let's say, decided, including the question of duties of investors. On the non-financial reporting front, I'm sure Tom Dodd will let us know all the details, but essentially the Commission is planning to introduce a reform of the current non-financial reporting directive in January, probably, alongside a decision on whether it would actually propose mandatory or quasi-mandatory European reporting standards to accompany the legislation. And finally, DG Justice is currently running a public consultation on legislative initiative in the area of sustainable corporate governance, which covers mandatory due diligence legislation, but also board obligations and directors' duties. So a couple of comments on each of these initiatives. Well, first of all, the mandatory due diligence has a unique purpose in this framework in that firstly, it provides operational means for companies to meet their responsibility to respect human rights as per the UN and OECD definitions of corporate responsibility. And it's the only part of the system that actually requires business enterprises to address human rights impacts. And hopefully it should also provide the means for affected people to access remedy. And no other tool can really supplement this role. So the system can't really work without this central element. The role of the other tools is, let's say, more, nuanced. The purpose of the non-financial reporting is to ensure that companies provide information necessary for understanding their impact, as well as, let's say, economic performance. And that's the definition of double materiality. And the availability and reliability of such information is critically influencing how stakeholders are able to engage with companies and potentially hold it or the directors to account. So one can think of the non-financial reporting as a front end for due diligence. as well as for more broadly for the company's approach to sustainability in the context of the Green Deal. According to the analysis of the Alliance for Corporate Transparency that Margaret mentioned, specifically on human rights due diligence, while a majority of companies in Europe do disclose their human rights policy, only 1 in 5 details their human rights due diligence process, at least in some way. But the reporting on concrete salient issues and what is company doing about those is very, very rare. And it drops to 3.6% when it comes to reporting examples or indicators of any sorts, documenting companies' effective management of the identified issues. And the results are slightly better for climate change matters and slightly worse for natural resources and biodiversity and so on and so forth. Now, investors depend on non-financial reporting to be able to meet their own responsibilities in this area and to take strategic investment and engagement decisions. Well, first of all, the disclosure regulation requires financial market participants to report on their due diligence. Then, due diligence, according to the OECD standards and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, apply conceptually to investors as well. And finally, as I've mentioned, any kind of strategic decision on the investment strategy by investors just require all this information that companies need to provide. Of course, the effect of all of this and the impact of, let's say, sustainable finance is proportionate to the impact of the EU sustainable finance agenda. So it all depends on the success and the breadth of the measures in this space that the European Commission may still pursue. The final piece of puzzle concerns the board obligations and directors' duties, which is part of the sustainable corporate governance agenda pursued by DG Justice. So there are 2 problems indicated by the research. Well, first is that the human rights due diligence process is of poor quality, at the companies, and thus it is not really reliable. Secondly, that process doesn't really lead to effective actions because often strategic decisions need to be taken and it's the directors who can take those decisions, and this connection simply does not work. In other words, there is a need to better define directors' responsibility for acting upon the results of the materiality determination as per the non-financial reporting requirements, as well as on due diligence. In this regard, the director's duties and responsibilities may strengthen the investor's means to exercise influence over the companies with respect to sustainability. It provides accountability for disclosures, for the accuracy and reliability disclosures, and it serves to ensure that the processes are really taken seriously within the company. And maybe most importantly, it builds accountability for those strategic decisions, including on, for example, changes of the business model, financing of the transformational activities, and so on and so forth. And let me conclude by saying that, just returning to my earlier point, that directors' duties, nor the other measures can really deliver on their own. They really need strong mandatory due diligence legislation to support. These are generally supportive measures. So I'll stop there in order not to go over time. Back over to you, Margaret.
Great, thanks, Filip, for laying out that framework and how they're connected, but also, I think, reminding us of how important mandatory due diligence is, and that you're the measure from the Alliance on Corporate Transparency and also the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark that have been showing that it's really not very good at the moment. So we really have some work to do cut out for us. I'm now pleased to turn the floor over to the person in the European Commission who probably knows more about the UN guiding principles than anyone. I know, Tom, you probably have a little more competition these days from your colleagues in DG Just, but Tom Dodd from DG FISMA has been working on the guiding principles for even longer than he's worked on the non-financial reporting directive, but Tom is in charge of that agenda and is going to give us the perspective from FISMA. I'll give you 1 second, Tom, but I'm also remind people to put your questions in the chat, because if you do that, I'll start throwing them out to speakers as we go along. So that's your incentive. But for the moment, Tom, I'm turning it over to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Margaret. Good afternoon, everybody. I do work in the European Commission on the non-financial reporting directive. That means I have a view on one particular part of the puzzle that Filip has talked about. I have some knowledge of the other parts, but I confess I'm not the all the elements of this puzzle. The Commission expects to put forward a proposal to revise the non-financial reporting directive in March next year, together with the new Sustainable Finance Action Plan. One of our challenges, one of our many challenges, will be to align corporate reporting with a number of different elements, and Filip has identified the key ones. First of all, the taxonomy. Taxonomy defines what can be considered as sustainable economic activities, and the taxonomy regulation already will require companies to disclose, to report their degree of alignment with those sustainable economic activities. Secondly, we've got the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is a reporting obligation on financial market participants or investors. It's clear that investors will struggle to meet their own reporting requirements unless or until they have good information from the companies that they invest in. So that's where the non-financial reporting directive comes in. We then also have what we think will be forthcoming proposal and eventually legislation on sustainable corporate governance and due diligence. We also have many other things in the European agenda. I won't go into them now, but you have things like the new climate law and other elements that can certainly link strongly with and influence our considerations of what companies should report. On the three elements I highlighted at the beginning, though, alignment to some extent will be easier in the case of the taxonomy and the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. Why? Because they're already in existence, even if some of their detailed regulatory provisions are not yet final. Alignment is more of a challenge in the case of sustainable corporate governance and due diligence, more of a challenge for us, at least, dealing with the non-financial reporting directive, simply because that proposal is due to come later. There are no magic solutions to this. We work very closely with our colleagues in the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice. I think we can all sort of establish and agree on a basic principle, which is that any reporting, any disclosure that might be necessary under the due diligence and sustainable corporate governance initiative should be provided for under the non-financial reporting directive. Or to put it in other words, we should try to avoid overlapping but slightly different reporting requirements on companies for the same issues. That seems to us to be a basic duty of public authorities in this regard. There's not really much secret about the fact that we think, at least at working level in the European Commission, that mandatory EU reporting standards are going to be necessary. We think that member states and the European Parliament are likely to agree on that, but of course we cannot take that for granted, and we certainly cannot be sure. In anticipation of any such decision, we have given a mandate to the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, to do preparatory work for the possible development of European standards, should it be decided that they are required. The resolution of some of these different coordination and alignment challenges, so corporate reporting, taxonomy, sustainable finance disclosure regulation, due diligence requirements, can come partly through the revision of the non-financial reporting directive, and critically, and this is important, through the development of any EU non-financial reporting standards. So this alignment question is one of the various critical issues that the EFRAG task force is looking into and on which it will make recommendations. Very briefly, another important point, again amongst many, that the EFRAG task force is looking at is how we could operationalize this double materiality perspective. So to make sure that companies really do report both outside-in risks to the company as well as inside-out impacts of their company. Last comment, this seminar is obviously about the coherence of the European plan. That is a challenge in itself and a very legitimate question to be discussing. But we also need to be talking about aligning that with what's going on globally. We do think that Europe's political ambition and Europe's existing legal framework make European non-financial reporting standards more or less unavoidable. But that has to be a step towards greater progress and alignment also at the global level. I'll stop there, Margaret. I hope I haven't gone too much over my time.
You have not, Tom. You were right on time, and I think highlighted again the linkages among these different pieces of legislation, and also again reassuring in case anyone was wondering that you all are very well aware and well coordinated across the Commission and searching for coherence, no overlap and alignment. I think also in terms of to a bit add to the picture, reminding that there are other pieces out there like the climate law. I would throw into it the consultation going on competition law and sustainability, which is also quite relevant. And indeed, the very important issue of what's going on in the international agenda. So thanks, Tom, for that. I'm now going to turn it over to Signe, Andreasen Lysgaard. She is a strategic advisor in the corporate engagement department at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And people probably know that that's Denmark's national human rights institute. One of the ones certainly leading on the business and human rights agenda in Europe and globally among the NHRIs. Also, Signe is recently appointed to the EU Sustainable Finance platform. So that's important to bring that voice into the platform. So Signe, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thanks all. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I was asked to speak about the linkages and the gaps between these different evolving agendas, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on the sustainable finance platform track later, but I thought I'd start off with two perhaps basic or at least cross-cutting points. And one has to do with the interrelatedness or the connectedness of the measures that we're talking about today. So in my view, we're seeing the development in a way of a web of a regulation here that is in essence working in the same direction towards the same goals, but taking slightly different means to the end. So that naturally gives a large degree of synergy, both in content, for instance, in my own field, of course, and relative to the topic of today, human rights and business standards being central to each of these. But it could also be in coming out with some of the other narratives that we hear, for instance, around combating short-termism, which is a central part of the corporate governance track, but also resonates with the larger ambition of the taxonomy about driving finance into something more sustainable. So in essence, of course, a lot of synergy or overlap, if you would, between the different measures in content, but we also see it in form. We see, for instance, the reporting element being a clear sort of linkage between all of these different measures, and therefore, of course, the need for alignment, as Tom was alluding to, becomes so central. But we also see some degree of siloing in the worst case, or at least developments that are happening in tandem. And I think what will be really important as we move along is to make sure that the guiding principles, international standards on human rights, keep being central to all these measures as we develop them, as we mature them, as we become technical about what one or the other measure should involve. So if we keep sort of coming back to the centrality of the guiding principles, we at least speak the same language, we make use of the same terminology across. I also think it's quite important that we communicate and coordinate across these developments. Certainly it's natural for organizations to be following one or the other, perhaps in more detail, but it's quite clear that these are really interlinked and will require alliance building, coordination, dialogue across the different files. The other sort of starting or overall point I wanted to make was is around timing. Given that these are developing in parallel, I think some pieces of the puzzle, if to reuse the picture that Tom was drawing, some pieces of the puzzle are arriving a little bit earlier than others. We saw it earlier this summer when we had the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation come out in consultation with also quite some concrete suggestions about what what disclosure could look like, also in terms of indicators on human rights performance and so on. So these are not irrelevant to a potential mandatory human rights due diligence law or to the NFRD. So as these pieces appear, it becomes critical that we stay dynamic in how these measures are evolving. If I then just speak quickly with my Sustainable Finance Platform member, CAP, I should say, of course, not speaking on behalf of the platform, but just as a member, I wanted to just add a few more words on this particular piece of the puzzle, also because that's not always perhaps where the business and human rights discussion is at. And perhaps that's only natural because the taxonomy indeed was green in its starting point. However, there is that inbuilt provision around minimum social safeguards. So for an investment to be taxonomy aligned, it needs to substantially contribute to environmental goals, but it also needs to do no significant harm to the other goals and to respect social safeguards, which is in a sense guiding principles, International Bill of Human Rights and ILO core level standards. So we have that again as a clear linkage point, but what does that mean as we start to perhaps have a mandatory Human Rights Due Diligence Act come into form? So there's that clear linkage point, and then there's a slightly perhaps more complicated linkage as we start to develop a potential social taxonomy. So that is early days in terms of looking at what a concrete measure would look like, but the platform on which I sit has been tasked by the Commission to advise it on the merits of extending the taxonomy to the social agenda and also the design of a potential social taxonomy. So that's on the table for the months and years to come. And as we discuss that, we do need to talk about what that means from a business and human rights, or what business and human rights can contribute rather to a social taxonomy. It's not an easy marriage. It does bring about some conceptual questions. To give an example, I mean, it's clear within our mandatory human rights due diligence track that we're talking about a measure that needs to tackle negative impacts, that needs to ensure that these are addressed and remedies provided where relevant. Whereas when we talk about the taxonomy, the starting point is a little bit different. We want to set objectives for positive developments. So here we enter into a needed discussion about what business and human rights and the UN guiding principles can contribute with, what the value or the transformative power, if you would, of business and human rights standards is, and what that means in terms of social objectives and a social taxonomy. So a lot of questions still to be answered, but what's quite clear is that the synergy is there, and that if we get these measures right, and if we get them to work alongside each other in good harmony, then we would be introducing both sticks and carrots, and notably that the taxonomy here is also a way to try and sort of mobilize the force of finance and really provide positive financial incentives for rights respecting businesses. So that does sound like a good match with some of the other things. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Signe. And you reminded us of the importance of that those international frameworks, the guiding principles, and I'm sure Barbara will also highlight the OECD guidelines, do in giving us that framework, but also the same language and concepts. One of the questions that we've had, which is one of my favorite questions, is indeed, we're thinking about this issue of the EU legislation forthcoming. It's not only on human rights due diligence, but it's on environmental due diligence as well. And I think the question is, how will that framework apply to environmental, how does the due diligence framework apply to the environmental dimensions? Barbara, I don't know if you want to pick that up, but otherwise we'll come to that in the question and answer sessions, and I'll continue to try to throw out some of these questions. So I'm now going to turn over to our company representative on the panel, and that is Théo Jaekel, I think I've gotten the pronunciation right, who's legal counsel and business and human rights expert at the Swedish ICT company Ericsson. Théo, you do have your camera back on. Okay, good, thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Very happy to be here on this panel. So yes, my role here is to provide maybe some background or views from the corporate sector on this topic, and I just wanted to start with saying that Ericsson previously this year was among some of the companies that supported this international statement in support of mandatory human rights due diligence on the EU level. So we have been involved in this discussion for quite some time and really see the benefits of creating a legal standard based on existing frameworks that have already been mentioned, such as the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, of course. We see this as an important step to, of course, create harmonization around these issues, legal certainty, and a level playing field. And that's also why we have clearly supported this on an EU level to create that harmonization. Of course, important, as was mentioned before, that we start this on an EU level, but hopefully that can also create incentives beyond the EU for other countries and markets to also start working on these issues. So on the synergies, from a corporate perspective, what we also think is very helpful if this gets implemented is currently as a company. So just a little bit background about Ericsson. We operate in around 180 countries globally. So we have to comply with different legislation in different countries, of course. And over the last couple of years, we've seen an emergence of human rights and corporate responsibility legislation in the EU, but also outside of the EU, which we, of course, think is a right step or a step in the right direction. But currently, there's a little bit of a disparity between all of these different regulations, and it creates challenges for us because we need to slightly maybe adapt our disclosures and reporting depending on different country requirements. And the same thing goes also from an investor point of view. All of these different emerging rankings, investor questionnaires, benchmarks, and so forth are often slightly different depending on who you're talking to. And this creates a lot of challenges for us to constantly needing to kind of start from scratch, depending on who is asking the question, what is the new benchmark, and so forth. So we believe creating this level playing field and a clear legal certainty of what is actually expected of companies can also help us in the dialogue with external stakeholders, such as financial institutions, to clarify, I mean, what is it that we are expected to disclose and act upon. I would, however, also want to clarify and state that it's very important that we don't only approach this issue from a disclosure point of view. I mean, of course, reporting and disclosure is an important part of any proper due diligence, but it's only one step of the due diligence measures that companies need to take. So why, again, I agree with what Filip said, that, I mean, without the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements, this just becomes another kind of reporting standard. And I don't think that's going to achieve what we want to achieve with this legislation, which should be better outcomes for people. So we have to really have that foundation and clear requirements on the other steps of due diligence, identifying risks, acting on the risk, tracking performance and everything, and that's clearly embedded in company strategies and processes. And then we can build clear disclosure requirements and expectations on that. Also agree with, of course, with the point on aligning this with the non-financial reporting directive. Speaking with other companies, I think one of the main concerns from a company perspective is creating a new reporting standards and separate reporting requirements, which again will only create administrative burdens and probably not impacts for people. So we have reporting standards, incorporate these then new human rights due diligence requirements in those reporting standards to have clarity on what we are expected to report on. I think also here on the synergies with the financial institutions and companies, that this could also be a tool for joint leverage. So not only viewing this of how then financial institutions can require such a disclosure or actions from companies, but how can we work together in increasing leverage deeper down in the supply chain or the entire value chain for that matter. So, I mean, we are currently, for example, discussing with export credit agencies and some investors on how we can address these issues together. So not just viewing this as a requirement that is kind of top down to us as a company, but how we can jointly then reach out to customers, or if it's suppliers in high-risk countries, and show that this is a joint effort. And again, I think having this clear then legal standard to base this on will make that easier. We already see that in some discussions with customers and suppliers, that when we refer to legal standards, even if those legal standards don't apply in the countries where the customer or supplier is based, they have an understanding for that we as a European company have to comply with those. While if we refer to, for example, Ericsson standards, policies, or more voluntary frameworks, there is much more pushback and less understanding to incorporate that into a more binding agreement. So I think having this legislation is also a tool for us to implement this in dialogue with customers and suppliers. So I think that's a great help as well. And then I just wanted also to touch on the issue of incentives here. I mean, of course, having these requirements from investors and financial institutions is of course a great help for us. But I think, again, I mean, how we frame these requirements, what is due diligence or what is good due diligence, I think it's important to not create a situation where companies only view this as a compliance issue or a tick box exercise, where you kind of are afraid of acknowledging risk or showing how you've taken action, even if that is acknowledging an impact and showing that you have acted or provided remedy. So building in these systems of how company due diligence procedures and actions are actually taken into consideration when we look at liability issues that of course need to be built into this legislation. I think that's also an important point to keep in mind. Yeah, just to wrap up, I think what was mentioned before about silos in the legislation is of course important but also silos in how we work with these issues. So again, going back to these synergies to really find ways of how these kinds of new requirements can strengthen collaboration between companies and investors, between companies and external stakeholders. I've seen that has been an issue in some of the discussions around the EU legislation. Should there be a requirement on external consultations as well, which I think is of course necessary. Hopefully I think this is moving in the right direction, and we are clearly in support of the need of this legislation. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Théo. First, for the very clear message of support. That's always important. I think that regulators hear that companies are actually asking for this, and then articulating your reasons why, right? In terms of harmonization, level playing field, but I think also your important point of the leverage that gives you with other partners and down your supply chain to get others to act. Because of course, what we need is that there are companies throughout the world that are acting on these issues. And so you've raised some really important points on synergy. I think also in terms of, you know, in a sense, we had non-financial disclosure first. What we need is human rights, the mandatory due diligence that feeds into good disclosure. And now, as Tom has pointed out, we're getting there, right? And that's part of this discussion. You also mentioned working with your export credit agency, which is a good segue into Barbara Bijelic, who's a policy officer at the OECD and working on responsible business conduct. Barbara does a lot of work on the financial sector. One of the things that Barbara is currently working on is guidance on these issues, on the application of the OECD guidelines, also to export credit agencies, but other financial institutions. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it over to you, but before I do, it's just a reminder, I think we will have some time for questions and answers, and I don't see many, surprisingly enough, in the chat box. Okay, maybe one more has come in. So I would encourage you to be thinking about your questions and answers. Because of the size of the audience, just as a reminder, we won't be able to take oral questions, so you need to put them in the chat box. So get your questions ready. So I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I think just starting off my remarks, I think it's important to recall that responsible business conduct, as how we interpret it, really means incorporating RBC considerations centrally in business operations, design, and models. And corporate governance frameworks are obviously key to that. They're key to establishing the right culture. They're key to ensuring there's sufficient resources and the right systems in place. Also key to ensuring that there's functional alignment so that everyone has the right incentives. There's not sort of competing obligations or expectations across different units of a business. So I think it makes a lot of sense to treat these issues together, as the EU has decided to do, as two sides of the same coin. Under our own frameworks, under the OECD due diligence guidance, we also kind of treat these issues together, and we have specific recommendations and expectations in the context of the due diligence approach that respond to corporate governance responsibilities. So, for example, we ask that companies assign oversight and responsibility for RBC due diligence to senior management and board level responsibilities for RBC more broadly. We ask that sufficient management systems and appropriate escalation processes related to environmental and social issues are established, that these processes are well resourced, and of course that there is sufficient public reporting on due diligence activities and outcomes. We haven't seen a legislative proposal yet for the director's duties portion of a potential directive, but I think it'll be important in the context of that to think not just about how this responsibility needs to be sort of integrated in these duties, but the actual practical activities and actions we would expect at a board and senior management level to ensure that these processes are possible and being implemented adequately. Then I think it's also important to recall that sort of regardless of how you feel about a shareholder primacy model, a big aspect of corporate governance is thinking about shareholder expectations and responding to those. So that's really where investors come in. Even before the EU introduced its sustainable finance strategy, investors were really calling for more responsible business conduct from corporates, more disclosure on these issues as seen as an increasingly material issue. Also because there's demand from beneficiaries ultimately that their investments go into positive investments, those with good social outcomes and good environmental outcomes. I think with the introduction of the investor sustainability disclosure regulation, of course, now investors have their own expectations in terms of how they undertake due diligence and report on that. And these will probably trickle down to issuers because, of course, as mentioned, investors will rely on disclosures from corporates to inform their own processes. So it's super, super important that we ensure alignment between expectations of financial service practitioners and also corporates. I think that I would agree with Signe that the spirit of all these initiatives, so the non-financial reporting directive, the director's duties, mandatory due diligence, and the pieces of legislation we've seen already under the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, they all really do align in spirit and objectives, but because they are happening at a different pace, being handled by sometimes different groups of people, there are some potential risks for coming up with frameworks that aren't completely coherent. And I think it was already mentioned, but I think terminology is one. I know that's in a way a detail, but we're seeing different terminology used for some of the same ideas across these laws. So principal adverse impacts on sustainability factors is mentioned in the investor disclosure regulation. The taxonomy refers to recommendations of the OECD guidelines as minimum safeguard standards. The INL published by the European Parliament talks about adverse impacts on human rights, environment, governance. Under the NFRD, we're talking about environmental social matters. I think most of these try to cover the same information, but when we include different words in regulation, there's a risk that those will later on be interpreted as intentionally different. So I think there needs to be some streamlining and clarity in that respect. I think also sometimes these concepts are being actually differently understood. So Signe mentioned over the summer, the draft regulatory technical standards for the investor sustainability disclosure were published. I think it was a really impressive effort by the EU to try to come up with some sort of comparable indicators and metrics on some of these issues. But also sort of the result of that process was equating adverse impacts to the set of predefined indicators that were necessarily general and rooted in sort of exposure to specific issues on a portfolio-wide level. That's really different than the types of information we're looking for in a due diligence process or that we see being asked for already in the context of the EU NFRD. I think it also potentially sort of risks having due diligence processes and efforts to actually prevent and mitigate impacts really focus on portfolio allocation decisions without also taking into account engagement activities, advocacy, maybe also offsetting positive investments. So I think, zooming out and thinking about these conceptually and going back to the international frameworks where these come from and trying to be sort of loyal to those concepts will be really helpful here and sort of avoid misinterpretation or potentially also negative outcomes such as driving investment away from high-risk geographies where there might be responsible operators. I think the last point I would make is just, I think something else we need to be careful about when we're linking these three different issues is questions of scope. Again, often when we're talking about corporate governance or investment, the focus is really on publicly listed companies. So if we're going to include due diligence reporting expectations in the EU NFRD, I think it has to be clear that that might apply beyond just large issuers as it does now. And then I think secondarily, we also have to think maybe with a little more clarity about what the relationship is between the information we're asking corporates and investors to collect, report on, and act on. how that actually relates to sort of the financial materiality of those issues. So I think the EU has been, pretty revolutionary in this respect. So asking companies to go beyond financial material issues to look at actual impact on environment and society. Same with investors. But I think now there's questions coming up with, well, how does that actually then relate to decisions that have to be based on financial materiality? To what extent can investors go beyond that? How do these two things relate to one another? And I think sort of further clarity around that and the relationship between the two will be really important to these issues going forward. So I'll leave it there, but happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Just quickly, the issues of coherence, particularly around terminology. I think we're hearing again and again the importance of regulators thinking through the incentives and disincentives around what's being required. And I think on your last question, it's an excellent segue into our last panelist, who is Tom Tayler. And Tom is Senior Manager at Aviva Investors Sustainable Finance Center for Excellence. And I'm also happy to say that Aviva is a partner in the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And Tom and I are sitting on a panel that's hosted by PRI, UNEP, FI, and the Generation Foundation, looking a bit at what Barbara just discussed in terms of investors' duties. Maybe you're going to discuss that, Tom, I don't know, but I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you for the invitation and the chance to speak on such an important issue. I agree with so much of what my fellow panelists have already said. In some respects, the curse of going last in a panel like this is that I can just say yes, I agree, and hand over. But I think with that investor perspective, perhaps drawing a line between some of these concepts that have already been so eloquently mentioned. So the sustainable finance package from the European Union has got a number of elements that look to embed concepts of due diligence around all sorts of things, but human rights in particular. And we've already heard reference to the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the regulatory technical standards that were consulted on in the summer. And in there, seeing the proposal on embedding this double materiality concept and the idea of not only looking at your sustainability risks as an investor and what's financially material to your investment decision, but also once the decision is made or in the process of making that decision, in your due diligence process, how are you identifying principal adverse impacts? How, once you've invested, are you prioritizing and mitigating those? And of course, human rights issues are featured in that list of adverse impacts that's put forward by ESMA. So not only looking at a disclosure of the proportion of portfolio companies that have a human rights policy, but also that have policies and processes for due diligence in their own supply chain. So making sure that this flows all the way through, not just for us as investors doing our due diligence, but ensuring that investee companies that we're investing in are also looking at their supply chains as well is important. And as has been mentioned a number of times, to do that effectively as investors, we need information from companies, and obviously the non-financial reporting directive review is crucial in that regard, but so are other initiatives related to corporate reporting. So Tom mentioned the EFRAG work. Of course, there's also work going on at IOSCO looking at similar issues, and the IFRS consulting, and myriad of other voluntary schemes that we're aware of. That slowly, it appears, there seems to be a sort of a drawing together of some of these schemes, so that we can agree on common principles, and that will be important. And then following through to the consultation from DG Just, looking at not only the mandatory due diligence on human rights and environmental matters, but also looking at directors' duties themselves and how corporate decision making needs to properly reflect the consideration of issues such as sustainability and environmental and human rights related issues. And I think that as a whole, there was a common thread that we've identified through the contributions of my fellow panelists in terms of a direction of travel, even though there are little bumps in the road and sometimes inconsistencies between them. I think in terms of, as you mentioned, Margaret, the initiatives like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and its new home within the World Benchmarking Alliance, both of which are initiatives that Aviva have been proud to be involved in. That the importance of initiatives like that in terms of naming and faming and naming and shaming those who are doing well and doing less well on these issues is crucial, not only for us as investors, but also increasingly our own ultimate customers, the people whose money it is that we are actually dealing with, care deeply about issues like this, and human rights is something that we know that our customers care deeply about, and they don't always have access to the same sort of information that we might as an investor. The person in the street doesn't sit with a Bloomberg terminal able to look at all the corporate data. So the role of initiatives like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark in making information available about the companies that make up the real economy, so that consumers can make informed choices both in their day-to-day lives, but also in how they allocate their money in their pensions and their investments is increasingly important and increasingly a factor that we see in our customers' preferences and therefore reflecting the way that we invest. And then finally, as you alluded to, Margaret, we've seen great strides in the understanding of fiduciary duty over the past few years, and the concept of impact and the concept of adverse impacts is one that now needs to be grappled with. It's good to see that as a specific question in the consultation that the Commission put out on their renewed Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and also the work that we have the pleasure to be involved in, Margaret, at the PRI with the legal framework for impact, looking at the duty of investors to not only consider the financial materials of these issues, but to consider the impact once we have allocated that capital. And I think that's a crucial point to consider too.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Tom, for bringing a number of those pieces together. And I hope that's illuminated a bit one of the questions that we had about investors doing their own due diligence. Tom, there was a question for you, which I didn't quite understand, but maybe you could chat with the person through it was a question about EFRAG specifically. We only have 2 more minutes left, but we had a number of questions about this issue of the linkage between the environmental and the human rights due diligence, and now added on climate change impacts and human rights due diligence. And I'm wondering if, Tom, you want to say whether through Aviva you have any linkage of looking at the linkage between those issues, or anybody else who wants to address that issue. Théo, there was also a question for you from David Schilling, but I'm going to ask you to address that on a side panel with David, if you would. So anybody want to take up the environment and human rights connection in due diligence? It's a key issue, and I'm not sure it has been addressed well to date, but it's crucial. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, one point I want to make, which actually isn't an Aviva specific one, but one which we were very gratified to see, was the resolution, I think the week before last in the European Parliament, encouraging all member states to call for the introduction of a right to a safe and clean environment, and that, I think, is a clear interlinking of the human rights and environmental agendas that we've seen human rights used very effectively in climate change litigation, the Agenda case being a key example. So that's a connection I'd like to highlight.
Perhaps if I can add, Margaret.
Sure, go ahead. And then I think I'll...
Okay, I'll go ahead. Just to add that I think these are good questions that are coming in on another way of looking at linkages here, because here we were talking more about different sort of regulatory instruments and the linkages, but then there's the aspect of the agenda overlapping and linking up. And I think it's well spotted by participants that this is an area that does require further work and thinking through of what does it mean to extend some of the obligations that we know from a human rights context around rights holder engagement, around remedy and so on. What would that mean in an environmental context and in other measures like the taxonomy, which I was alluding to here, where the environmental chapter has sort of been built first? What would that mean when we try to inherit or bring across some of the architecture that was built on the environmental foundation, when we try to extend that to other topics? So I think that is really still an area that has quite some questions attached to it, but that will require consolidation across, and also where we do have frameworks like the OECD guidelines that already provide a platform across several agendas.
Okay, yes. And we shouldn't forget that the management system approach has been around in environment long before it was in human rights. Barbara, you said you wanted to come in. 30 seconds. Filip, 30 seconds, and then I'll have to close and turn over. Thank you, Signe.
Yeah, just to note quickly that the OECD standards also cover environmental impacts, including climate. So we would expect due diligence processes to also environmental risks and impacts in the same way as human rights, really identifying, also doing their prioritization activity to identify the most significant areas and have that inform action. I think it's important to also understand the very important interlinkages between human rights and climate and start thinking about climate issues as human rights impacts. And then broadly, I would just say we're trying to expand our environment work to think through some of these conceptual issues a little more. I think when it comes to environmental impacts, particularly climate, because the actual impact, is related to transboundary, cumulative, diffuse, and long-term impacts. Really, the unit of analysis for thinking about a company's contribution to that needs to be about its own activities. So to what extent are companies undermining mitigation activities or adaptation activities? To what extent are they contributing to carbon footprints, in or outside the scope of international objectives? But sometimes,
I'm going to have to stop you there because Filip wanted to come in, and then we absolutely have to turn over. But thank you, Barbara. Filip, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Barbara. Just to follow on what you said, there is a bigger share of, let's say, of environmental impacts that are conceptually similar to human rights impacts, and thus due diligence can be relatively easily applied to them. The question is, of course, is what fits in, what doesn't. As regards to climate change, it's possible as well, but there may be more effective measures how to ensure corporate responsibility. It's more quantitative, it's more dispersed, so there may be let's say more effective alternative strategies. That's all. You're muted.
If I can thank you, Filip. Thanks to the rest of the panel. I'm now going to turn it over to Rachel. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Margaret, and thanks for a really, really interesting panel. So I'm Rachel Owens, and I'm the head of the EU Office for Global Witness, and I also lead on our corporate accountability campaign. So the second panel, we're going to focus really on this issue of kind of investor due diligence and looking at investor leverage. So we've been talking quite a lot about the EU approach to corporate accountability, and particularly really focusing in on the legislation we are expecting to come from the European Commission next year. And we've got a great panel in the second session today to really get into the detail of what the inclusion of the financial sector or investors in. And just as a reminder, this has shown that if you just look at, for example, the issue of deforestation, the financing of 6 major agribusiness companies linked to forest destruction in climate critical forests in the Amazon, Congo Basin and Papua New Guinea was actually funded in a very large part from EU-based financial institutions. So it was to a tune of 7 billion euros between 2013 and 2019. So that just gives you a sense of kind of what the issue is we're trying to tackle here. We know that money is flowing into projects which cause human rights abuses or into companies which cause human rights abuses and environmental destruction. And in order to really ensure that the EU's Green Deal is properly effective and the EU is living up to its human rights objectives, we need to make sure that financing is not flowing and that the financial sector needs to be kind of part of the equation, as we heard before. And it was brilliant to hear, as Margaret said, the kind of support that we've seen not only from civil society organizations but from businesses, from companies and investors in terms of in this direction. So what we will start off with is an introduction from our colleague David Schilling, who's from the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, who have put out 2 important statements on this issue. Firstly, on the issue of the need for investor due diligence, and secondly, more recently, on the need for legislation around company due diligence. We'll then move on to 2 rounds of questions for our brilliant speaker for some questions in the chat box. So if you have any, please put them into the chat. And then at the end, we'll have some closing remarks from a colleague from the German presidency. So the chair of the, Andreas Jacobs, the chair of the Council Working Party for Development Cooperation. So many thanks to all our speakers today. So I'll just hand over to David and then I'll introduce the rest of the speakers in more detail. David, please take it away.
Great, Rachel, thanks so much. And it's wonderful to be with each of you, such an important topic. For me, the case for mandatory human rights due diligence is actually visibly and vividly being made every day as part of the global economy is still in severe crisis. And most sectors and supply chains that are connected to European and US consumer markets are still in deep distress. The COVID-19, I think, has revealed the flaws of voluntary corporate initiatives that fail to address the negative human rights impacts and environmental impacts on workers and communities, with millions of workers still have lost their livelihoods, unable to provide for themselves and their families, egregious human rights violation. The lessons being learned, I think, though, are prompting governments and investors and companies to rethink the current approaches that we've utilized in this space and begin to envision building back an economy that's equitable, that's resilient, that really addresses the human rights and environmental challenges facing people and the planet. So clearly, investors have a crucial role to play in shaping the direction of mandatory human rights due diligence. As you said, Rachel, the Investor Alliance for Human Rights coordinated a statement like in April, investor case for mandatory human rights due diligence, 105 investors signing on, showing some real support, representing about US 5 trillion in assets under management collectively. The investors believe all businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights and have been working on this for a very long time, especially since the UN Guiding Principles were adopted in 2011, and to really conduct a kind of a strategic ongoing human rights due diligence as a core requirement to fulfill their responsibility. Investors also recognize that governments, international institutions that need to be protecting against human rights abuses by business through effective regulatory measures have a major role to play, particularly where there are significant gaps in human rights protections. So investors that signed this statement are very active in this area. We're trying to expand that to other investors and clearly calling on governments to develop and enforce mandatory human rights due diligence requirements, and also recognizing the role of investors in terms of their own responsibilities for human rights. So mandating companies to perform human rights due diligence enables investors, as the point has been said in the earlier panel, to fulfill their responsibility to respect human rights and conduct strategic due diligence, not yet another tick box exercise. We've got to be really careful here, but due diligence that leads to impact for rights holders. That's, I think, the point. So investors have a kind of a dual role of engaging portfolio companies on human rights due diligence, as well as responding for putting in place the human rights due diligence into their own institutions and their decision-making process as they make decisions about investments and the stewardship of that. So to me, the investors, one of the key elements here will be the quality of data that is collected. And if it's the tick box, of course, we know what that means and what it does and doesn't do. But if it's very strategic and the data enables investors and companies to fulfill their due diligence, that should be focused on not just the policies and practices, but outcomes and impacts on rights holders. And right now I'm just thinking, there's so many different situations, but we're doing a lot of work with portfolio companies and investor responsibility. When you think of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, and Uyghurs as well as other Muslim communities are just being subjected to egregious human rights violations. And there's so many connections, different layers of companies as well as investors, and having to take a serious look at what needs to be done in terms of, in the end, I think, disengaging many of those relationships. I think of the Peru in the Amazon, where the Forest Peoples Program is working. Human rights defenders need to be supported, and this process needs to really address that. And investors have to get more closely aligned with those in the field, whether you're in Peru and you're working against the imposition of a palm oil plantation in the middle of the Amazon, and those that are organizing to address that have their lives really at stake. It's a life and death issue. Or in Brazil, where so many great people, Julia, are working in a network to look at what kind of development do communities need instead of being imposed by major investment institutions. So we have a lot to look at in this area, but let's not forget it's not a reporting disclosure issue alone. It's life and death at the level of communities. So in May, the Investor Alliance put together Investor Toolkit as a kind of a guidance document that'll enable us to work with more asset owners and asset managers on practical ways that first embedding the policies within the investor institution and then through the level of the investment cycle. So it's clear from so many specific cases that investors can be and are implicated in adverse impacts, notably by funding companies or projects linked to human rights abuses. If companies are doing, yet again, the superficial due diligence or not at all, it makes it more challenging for investors to know what the risks are in their portfolio companies and what they're facing, and to conduct their own due diligence. The European Commission supply chain study, which I found really fascinating, they found after all these surveys of companies, about a third were doing some form of human rights due diligence, 1/3. And earlier this week, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark released its findings that are really looking at 230 companies in different sectors. And there are a number of companies that are meeting some of the fundamental expectations of the UNGPs with strong commitments and rigorous processes in place. However, only a minority of companies just demonstrated the willingness and commitment to take human rights seriously. And there is a big disconnect between commitments and processes on the one hand and actual performance and results on the other. So voluntary reporting and risk assessment processes not focused on risks to people leave companies and their investors and stakeholders in the dark about corporate caused abuses to workers, communities, and the environment. While existing disclosure regulations focus on transparency and reporting, and there are some developments here as the non-financial reporting directive gets reformed, we have the huge opportunity with mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation that can shift to the opportunities to ensure behavior change, to build into the process information that really affects the business model and the strategic planning, not just as a side department within a company. And that gets at issues like access to remedy for victims, including bolder sanctions and liabilities for harms that a business or an investor could have prevented but failed to do so. So I think the positive is that the trend is definitely moving towards mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, which is good news for investors and companies and governments. And in the next little bit, the Swiss voters will be deciding on a far-reaching referendum, introducing mandatory human rights due diligence and direct liability of businesses for breaches of human rights and environmental standards. So with this, and of course, the legislation coming in the first quarter around human rights and environmental due diligence, it is great to see that the momentum is going this way. And I think the benchmark for really measuring as we move forward and get this established will be how is it impacting the rights holders who have waited too long for root causes of human rights abuses and environmental damage to be addressed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was a really, really strong message from the investor community. And I hope you can hear me all okay, because my colleague texted me to say there were some problems with my connection. So hopefully it's a bit better now. But that was a really great introduction, David. Thank you. And really kind of talking about this point about the rights holders being at the heart of the discussion and the heart of the process. And I think that's a really important kind of starting point to then go into the panel discussion. I think as you've outlined for a very long time, there's been this imbalance between the kind of the power of the corporate sector and the investor sector and those on the ground who are actually really trying to kind of protect their environment or ensure their communities can still have livelihoods. And we'll hear from colleagues during the panel about some of those issues and put forward some solutions as you were suggesting. And I'm really glad you ended on a hopeful note as well. And hopefully we can bring that into the panel discussion. So great, we'll jump into the first round panel discussion. So firstly, we have Caroline Rees, who is president and co-founder of Shift, which is a non-for-profit mission-driven organization that works across all continents and sectors to challenge assumptions, push boundaries, and redefine corporate practice in order to build a world where business gets done with respect for people's dignity. So it's great to have you here, Caroline. Thank you. And everyone can see a more detailed bio on the Erin page of this event. So Caroline, what are the potentials and limitations of ESG data use by investors, and what do you see as the kind of current challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and it's really a pleasure to be part of the conversation today. I've enjoyed listening to the conversation that went before. This issue of data is so critical, and as David Schilling alluded to, in this moment of COVID, we've seen more attention come onto the effects of how business practices reverberate in the lives of many of the most vulnerable workers and communities, and increased interest in the S in ESG, and increased calls for improvements in the data. And I think in many regards, you know, we've had a sort of a collective problem in this field that inevitably, as one tries to assess and rank and rate companies, who's drawing a lot on what's publicly disclosed and put it out there by companies in their reporting. And at the same time, companies are motivated to keep putting that same type of stuff out because it's what they get ranked and rated on. And so we get sort of trapped in a data cycle with a challenge to stand back and say, but is this data actually telling us something useful? And I think we see 4 key problems of quality in a lot of the current data types. One is where data can be, if I can put it cynically, gamed too easily. So, you know, at one point it was really indicative of something if a company had a human rights policy, because there was nothing pressuring them to do so. So it suggested there was an internal thought process that this mattered. Nowadays, as one gets measured on words in policies, there's a proliferation happening, and it's much less indicative of that deep thought process. So it becomes less valuable as an insight. A second is data that is superficial, that has no necessary link or correlation with the likelihood of outcomes for people, better outcomes for people. The number of hours of training done, the number of social audits done. It's not to say one shouldn't train people and one shouldn't do social audits, but they're not indicative of the actual outcomes for people. There's an enormous leap between those processes and outcomes. The third is data that can be misleading, looking, for instance, at the percentage of a supply chain at significant risk of forced labor. And we know it's almost impossible to come up with that number with a phenomenon like forced labor. It doesn't tell us anything about what the company is doing about that situation. And it gives the illusion of comparability. You think you can compare that between companies, but without context and without qualitative information, you really can't. And so it leads to false security in the conclusions being drawn. And the fourth problem is perverse consequences. For instance, the numbers of grievances received, right? One of the phenomena that can happen there is if you make that a measurement, a metric, human behavior plays to that. And so suddenly there are subtle incentives for something not to be named as a grievance, not to find grievances because you want to keep your numbers down. So these are some of the problems we see in the data that is currently dominating in the field. And yet we don't need to be locked into that. And I think we do see opportunities to really change the mix. Some of the data that the Workforce Disclosure Initiative promotes around workforce composition is very indicative of something. If you've got a large proportion of your workforce on short-term contracts, when you look at pay ratios, pay gaps, when you look at the coverage of freedom of association and collective bargaining, we do have some really good leading indicators in those kinds of metrics. And we're also in our work at Shift looking a lot at a different kind of leading indicator around the behaviors of leaders and boards, and looking at business models. Where are risks to people embedded into business models and are not being addressed as such? These are things that really suggest, is the company wired in ways that are going to have negative impacts on people, or through good leadership and governance, is it wired to find those issues and sort them out? So there's an opportunity to change the mix, but we do need to change the mix if we're going to have proper insight into who's doing well and who isn't.
Great, Caroline, that's great. Really clear message there in terms of what some of the challenges are. So we'll move on to Nikolai now, who is a senior specialist at the UN PRI's Sustainable Markets Department and the temporary lead on the organization's human rights program. So thanks very much for being with us. How can the EU's mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which would cover hopefully the financial sector, bridge this implementation gap and ensure the effectiveness of formal business policies and processes?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel, and it's great to be on this panel and part of this session today. So I think, as some of the previous speakers has already alluded to, there's clearly an implementation gap, sorry, as you suggest in your question as well. We heard from Filip, obviously, the Frank Bold research suggesting that only 20% of companies are conducting due diligence. The corporate human rights benchmarks results from earlier in the week gave similar evidence. But speaking on behalf of the PRI, we also have to be honest that the investment community is unfortunately falling short in the current environment. So it is pretty clear that voluntary policy measures and disclosure requirement has not been enough. So just to answer your question, I'd like to highlight two areas where I think the mandatory human rights legislation could make a difference. And it's hard not to repeat some of the points that were made in the previous session, but I guess that just pays testament to the fact that perhaps we are at least now at some agreement and moving in a good direction. So the first one I'd like to make is just that mandatory human rights due diligence will, of course, establish responsibilities also for investors, both as operating companies, but most importantly, in relation to their investment activities as providers of capital. This is, of course, where they have the most influence. So although we have had established norms on this issue for almost a decade with the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, it is unfortunately the case, as I said, that we haven't seen a lot of adoption. So if we look at the PRI's reporting framework, there is actually almost as much as 42% of signatures that mention human rights in some shape or form in relation to their responsible investment activities. But if we get a bit more specific, one of the questions we ask is whether they use the OECD guidelines or UN Guiding Principles in screening of portfolios. This is less than 10% of signatures that conduct this type of activity. If we look at collaborative engagements, of which the PRI has run quite a few over the last 5 years using the UN Guiding Principles, it's less than 5% of PRI signatures that have participated in these engagements with companies. So obviously on the investor side, there's a lot more to be done as well. So luckily this is changing within the EU, of course, with the sustainable finance regulation and the disclosure requirements. But the mandatory due diligence, of course, takes this one step further, not only looking at disclosure, but also the due diligence practices and introducing that as a core part of responsible investment. So this is obviously key in terms of mandating implementation in a more forceful way. And I think one way to look at it is disclosure requirements, as we're seeing within the EU, are essentially to avoid greenwashing or blue washing or rainbow washing or whichever type of washing we can think of. But actually, when you introduce mandatory human rights due diligence, you remove that whole issue, because if the practice becomes the standard, investors don't distinguish themselves relative to what everyone is doing. So that is another more forceful way, I think, to eliminate the same problem. So that's the first point, obviously, the investor responsibilities. The second one, and this was mentioned quite a few times in the previous panel, so excuse me for repeating some of those points, but of course, investors are reliant on company information and company implementation of due diligence practices, both on human rights and environmental issues. And in a way, you could say that the sustainable finance regulation has front-run this issue in a way, because the disclosure requirements have been put on investors, but they have in many cases not been able to obtain the information they require to make the right investment decisions and to conduct informed stewardship activities with companies. So of course, we welcome this as a solution to that problem as well. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at there, but obviously very key that there are synergies between these two types of regimes in the regulation.
Definitely, Nikolai. That's a really great point to end on. And thank you for for kind of giving us a sense of what some of the issues are as well. Some of those numbers were quite stark. But as you said, we're moving in the right direction. And this shift from just pure disclosure and transparency being the golden bullet to, a change in behavior, both in investors and companies. So on that note, we'll move on to Felicitas Weber, who is the Know the Chain Project Director at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Thank you very much for joining us. Oh, I'm just looking. I actually do not have a question for you. Here we go. Yes, I do. Sorry. What is the role and responsibility of investors regarding, no, sorry, that isn't your question. Apologies. I'm just going to move on to Julia, and I'm going to find the question that should have been for Felicitas, and then go back to you if that's okay. So moving on to Julia Neva, who is the coordinator of development and social environmental rights at Connectus, which is an organization based in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And Julia is a lawyer and a human rights activist. And thank you so much for joining us today from Brazil. So the question I have for you is, what is the role and responsibility of investors regarding engagement with local communities? And are there examples where investors have played a role in remediating harms suffered by communities?
Thank you, Rachel. So good afternoon, good morning for those who are in the morning. It's a pleasure to be here today in such an important panel, and I'm very happy to be speaking today with so many good friends with whom I have worked for so many years at the Business and Human Rights Research Center, and also colleagues from the field. Thank you to Hans for the invitation. So as we've been hearing today, the role and responsibility of investors regarding human rights impacts and violations have been increasing over the years. And as we know, one of the reasons for that is the understanding that investors as business enterprises can also be involved in human rights impact violations, and the UN guiding principles can guide us in these discussions. This means that investors should also be responsible for such impacts and human rights violations related to their activities. A core principle regarding human rights protection is that affected communities and victims should always be heard. And even more than that, they should have the right to be in the decision-making process that affect their lives. As the Investors Alliance for Human Rights has pointed out before, investors therefore need to know the risks to people connected with their investment activities and show how they take action to manage those risks. This means really to listen to affected communities and change the way of investing. Responsible investing is an urgency, and it should have human rights as one of the most important criteria. It cannot be only about profit. Considering that, I would like to share a very interesting experience of a dialogue between investors and affected communities that were affected by the mining sector in Brazil. This dialogue started 2 years ago, communities affected by the disaster of Rio Doce started talking to investors, and they asked the Business and Human Rights Research Center and Caritas from Brazil to help them in these dialogues. We started talking to Lot Forum, PRI, and the Church of England, and some other groups. And the main idea was to engage in order to pressure for more responsible and sustainable process in the mining sector, and to point out structural flaws in the mining model and the responsibilities of public authorities, companies, and sectors, and investor sectors, not only in Brazil, but in the mining sector worldwide. Just to recall you, the Rio Doce disaster involved some of the 2 main mining companies in the world, and also main investors in the world. And what this disaster has shown is that both companies and investors as companies have benefited from investments and contracts that were made under a permissive mining model that is rife with environmental disasters. The Rio Doce disaster happened 5 years ago, and it was the largest environmental and social crime involving mining dams in Brazil, and one of the biggest in the world. Some of you may remember there was a sea of mud with more than 40 million cubic meters of iron ore tailing dumps that not only caused the complete destruction of residential areas, but also killed 90 people. 4 years after this disaster, the Brumadinho Dam disaster also happened, and it killed more than 2,700 people. There are still people missing, and there were 12 million cubic meters of tailing dams that was spilled. This contaminated water supplies and seriously damaged the environment. So when communities started this dialogue, they wanted to raise international awareness, but also show investors that they had some responsibility regarding these disasters. After this dialogue started, some funds have announced their divestment from these mining companies on the grounds that their profits cannot be derived from irresponsible operations. Investors also launched an investor mining and tailing safety initiative that it is an investor-led engagement, and it seeks to raise standards for tailing dams worldwide. That was a global review also on standards, but despite these efforts, reparation has not yet been met. So 5 years after the first disaster, nearly 2 years after the second disaster, there hasn't been reparation. However, we do believe that the dialogues with the investors are very powerful and important to help seek reparation, but also to hold companies accountable for those human rights violations, including investors. I don't know if I still have some minutes, but I can come back later if I still have some time.
Thank you so much, Julia, and really kind of quite humbling your example, to be honest. It reminds us, you know, while we talk about ESG and all these kind of like terminology, there's actually real people behind this, and that's why we're all here today, really, as well as the environmental impacts and just fantastic work that you and your colleagues and partners across Brazil are doing, and really importantly that there hasn't been the reparations repaid, which I think is the message that you want to get across. Thank you so much. So now we'll go back to Felicitas. I found her question in my document, so apologies about that. So Felicitas, as I said, comes from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And so particularly moving on from the points we've just heard from Julia, how do you think we can promote remediation efforts across a responsible business and conduct framework, and particularly this issue of kind of rights holder engagement? It would be great to hear from you on.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I was wondering whether we had already solved all the questions. So yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about really building on from what Julia said, right? Rights holders should be at the center, and there's a very stark need for and lack of data also on rights holder engagement and remediation. So very similar to the data that we heard earlier on from the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, for example. Similarly, now the chain has also found that even when we look at the worst forms of exploitation, and even when we look at the largest global companies in the highest risk sectors, there's significant gaps, right? When we looked at the 60 largest food companies, for example, they nearly all of them, you know, prohibit forced labor, but then, you know, not even a quarter of them engage local stakeholders. Only 2 of them really show how they support freedom of association in their supply chain and really support those human rights defenders that, like union members that safeguard human rights, and only 3 disclose concrete remedy outcomes, right? And I think that's a lot of the time, unfortunately, what we really need, to Julia's point. On the other hand, when it comes to eradicating labor rights abuse, the most effective models are, unsurprisingly, you know, those that are worker driven, that are bottom up, where workers are included and designing and implementing the solutions. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples of this rights holder engagement, of how investors have done that around the world. So the first one is from Australia, where the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility has filed several shareholder resolutions, including at a supermarket Coles, really using the worker-driven social responsibility model and very clearly asking for worker-to-worker education, asking for worker-led grievance mechanism, asking also for compliance to be determined with the inclusion of workers. In the US, we've been working a lot with David and his colleagues and the investor advocates for social justice, and also just in examples in webinars where we share data on what companies are doing, where investors share their engagement dialogues with companies, really also bringing in rights holder perspective and bringing in migrant worker groups that can then share with investors the realities on the ground, which are particularly important in times like COVID, where companies putting out statement on what they're doing to protect workers and then getting a sense check from workers what is actually happening. And the third one is an example from Europe, where the Norwegian Government Pension Fund undertook an investigation into an Indian textile company, and spoke to a number of the workers who reported verbal and physical punishment, harassment, lack of engagement with unions. And the investor then really highlighted the importance that they attached to these worker testimonies, and not least as the company wasn't even open to discuss these issues, decided to divest earlier this year. So these are just a few examples in addition to what Julia shared of how investors have been engaging and can bring this rights holder engagement into their own due diligence processes. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Rachel.
Great, thanks so much, Felicitas. That's really helpful to see also the kind of really positive ways that investors are engaging and different examples as well about how to achieve the change that we want to see. So now I'll move on to Peter Webster, who is the CEO of the Eris Foundation, which works to increase the impact of responsible investment and is based on more than 30 years experience of ESG research and promoting this particular concept. So thanks very much for joining us, Peter. So how will the new sustainable finance rules open up the world of sustainable investment to a whole new set of actors? And what do you think the consequences of this are?
So thanks, Rachel. And like the others, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel, and to be on a panel with so many people who've done so much in this area is also a great pleasure. I mean, I could bring to the panel my experience of the Eris Foundation doing the research for CHRB and so on, but I think the experience of being a board member of PRI and the UK Sustainable Investment Finance Association is probably more relevant. So in terms of the new people brought to the field by the EU's activities, I totted up all the banks, insurance companies and pension funds that are covered by the new regulations. And there's probably double counting, and some organizations have an office in each country and all the rest of it, but the raw figures add up to 20,000. So we have a huge number of financial institutions who will be covered by this regulation. If you compare it with PRI, there's probably 1,200, 1,500 European signatories of PRI. So it's orders of magnitude more people being drawn in. So what kind of people are they? I think a lot of them are, this reference to tick box, there are going to be a lot of tick box people. I think tick box is slightly underrated actually as a tool. Personally, I wouldn't want to be on an aeroplane if the pilot didn't have a tick box system, and I'm not sure I'd be taking any medicines if they hadn't been through a tick box process either, but it's a different mindset. And it will typically be compliance that gets to look at these things rather than just ESG units or more creative people, because the EU is requiring every institution to identify across all its investments what its primary impacts are. And they include things like we're talking about here today, what proportion of your investments are in companies who have not conducted human rights due diligence. And that means you need to know for every company you invest in, whether it's done it or not. So this is on a huge scale compared to anything that's gone on before. There are also all sorts of reforms happening to the retail market. So there are more than 2,000 sustainable, ethical, responsible funds for retail investors. All of those are going to be subject to new disclosure requirements. They will have to clarify their purposes. They will have to clarify how they actually implement the purpose and explain that. If they use a benchmark, which many of them do, they will have to align their benchmarks with the social goals and the environmental goals that they have. So, I mean, this is seismic shift in the world of finance. But also behind that, that means all of the public will then be touched by this. So up to now, perhaps you had to go looking for a responsible investment fund if you were an individual, or look for a more sustainable bank if you were keen on that. Now, every bank, every insurance company, every pension fund is going to have to be talking about this stuff. So suddenly the whole of the public become the audience for the campaigning work that people on this conference are trying to do. So I think that has all sorts of rather interesting impacts. Basically, for campaigners, this is really good news. But I think we also need to think about, because it's going to be more universal and more compliancy and more tick boxy as well, it's a bit different. So it's less like, as a parallel, campaigning for veganism, say, or campaigning for organic food. You try to think, how do we find some leaders? How do we challenge people to say, you might like to try this? How do we, find the reliable ways of delivering it? It's more like trying to roll out decent health and safety systems where everybody's doing it, but some are doing it slightly better than others. It's the law. You know, it's a different kind of mindset to how do you get continuous improvement across a whole system, rather than how do you advocate for something new around the edges that will help to drive change. So yeah, I think that's in a way the consequence is that campaigning will look a little different, but actually has a huge number of new opportunities to take things forward. And it means that people who are trying to think of how to develop things do need to think, okay, tick box and compliance we will have. How do we want to use those forces to produce the answers that we want to see on the ground for all the reasons that people have been discussing today, the importance of the underlying issues.
Great, Peter, that was really clear. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to all of our speakers for the first round. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Mauricio from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre to lead us on a quick fire second round questions, and then we'll move to our final speaker, Andreas, as well. Mauricio, are you there?
I'm here. Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everybody. This has been a fascinating discussion. So we had thought about asking each of the panelists a second kind of question tailored for each one, but instead of that, and because I'm aware of the time, we don't have a lot of time left, we thought we just instead ask one question that is practical oriented, practically focused, and ask all of you 5 to please do a quick round in the same order in which you spoke to answer this question. And this question really is about, given all that we have heard today, all the excellent interventions and all the excellent ideas that we've heard today, going forward to promote the concept of mandatory due diligence, both for your own activities and for companies, what kind of action would you like to see from investors is the first part of the question, and the second one from EU policymakers. So what type of action is the one that we most need at the moment, if you were to point just to one or two top things? So let's start with you, Caroline.
In the line of fire on that one. In terms of investor action, we've got to crack the nut of portfolio screening, right? There's a lot that can be done with engagement. We need the power of engagement, and we need engagement to move from the predominant zone of engaging the sustainability folks, and we need to move it into the investor relations folks and those quarterly calls. That one well-placed question, right? That really triggers questions inside the company. So we need to move it to there, and we need to crack that nut of portfolio screening. That's the hardest thing, to do this at large scale. How do we move beyond sort of some generalized sector-based assumptions that inform portfolio decisions to some indicators that get us further into this due diligence piece, not just the fact of due diligence, but the quality of due diligence. So I think that's one key piece. In the EU arena, so much has been said about coherence. We know that reporting is not the answer, but it is a linchpin in this, right? It's the linchpin between mandatory human rights due diligence on companies having to do this, and that piece about the responsibility of investors and having the information to make the decisions that drive the market forces. So really making sure that those three pieces speak to each other, that the reporting reflects what people in companies are being told they need to do through mandatory human rights due diligence, so that the investors are then equipped to drive their own decisions and their engagement activities grounded on that. We have to have those three pieces speaking to each other.
Very good. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nikolai.
Thank you, Mauricio. So I think on the first question at the PRI, and I'm going to do a bit of shameless promotion here, Mauricio, since you're giving me the chance. We put out a paper 4 weeks ago just to set expectations on institutional investors on human rights, using obviously the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, and you can check that out in our work program. But one thing that's worth highlighting is, of course, addressing what I said in my first remarks about the fact that it's only a small share of investors that are looking at these standards at the moment, is we'll be introducing reporting on this issue for our signatories. So that's one action on that specifically. In relation to the EU, of course, a lot has been said today about the mandatory human rights due diligence, which is very important, and there's a lot of practice questions that we need to resolve very quickly, as Caroline has just highlighted. But I'm personally also quite excited about the prospect of a discussion around the social taxonomy and starting to think in positive terms around what are the types of economic activity, what are the types of social policy goals of the EU, and how can we have a complementary conversation around how to drive capital into those types of activities.
Thank you very much. And please feel free to share the link to the report on the chat box in case it's helpful for people. That's great. So over to you, Julia, now.
Thank you, Mauricio. So regarding investors, I think that investors should continue talking to communities, but always be responsible when talking to the communities. Remember, they have been suffering from the impact of their investments, and if possible, visit the territories where these human rights violations might happen or have already happened. So that's something important. The work the Business Human Rights Research Center, Caritas, and Connected have been doing together can help guide investors in this reach out. And regarding the legislation, the EU legislation or Brazilian legislation, I think it's very important a few aspects. So I think it's important that this consider the views of affected communities. They should be consulted at all levels and in all time. This legislation should also think of liability measures, if possible, to reverse the burden of proof. This is very important for our regions. And I think we need to find ways to hold the companies accountable in this legislation. It cannot only be about reporting, as my colleagues have said before. So that's it. I will give the space to others. Thank you, Mauricio.
Thank you very much, Julia, and really so much to learn from that experience regarding communities in Brazil and investors in Europe. Felicitas, over to you now.
Thank you, Mauricio. Would just echo Julia's point on investors. We would really want them to see them to use their leverage to ensure outcomes for rights holders. It's really not okay that there is no remediation in so many cases, and investors have significant leverage that they need to leverage more. I think also colleagues have been working on investor guidance, specifically looking at human rights defenders and how their rights can be protected. And investors can also add their voice to call for mandatory human rights due diligence, like David and colleagues have done, and how our colleagues are also collecting company responses, investor responses that support that legislation. And I think from a policymaker perspective, again, ensuring that there is meaningful participation of rights holders, including from the Global South, but also really that the legal text reflects the needs and concerns of rights holders, that there is a gender perspective, that there are safeguards for human rights defenders, and just reiterating Julia's point, but there needs to be enforcement mechanism, especially legal liability and access to remedy, and reverse burden of proof is really key for that.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much. And last but not least, Peter, please.
Yes, so investors, I mean, basically, you should look to investors to do a couple of things in general. One is to provide capital for things, which isn't quite what we're talking about now, but is often very relevant to other sustainability discussions. And the other is about the governance of the assets that they currently own. So I would say, I mean, I don't want to disagree with what everyone said about what investors can do, but I think even if I look at PRI's paper on human rights, which is very good, there's not enough emphasis on the fact that primarily investors should be insisting that companies do the human rights due diligence properly. So if they fail to do so, or if something comes to their attention, yes, they should dive in and they should take up and use the leverage and so forth. But we're talking now about doing this across, for an individual investor, 8,000 companies or 3,000 companies or something like this. They have to have a quite small ask of a very large number of people. And I think if they can be making a lot of noise about the importance that companies do their human rights due diligence, and obviously part of that is publishing the results and giving feedback and so on. So become more expert in assessing whether they've done it right rather than trying to do it for them, I think would be a good general plan. In terms of the role of the EU, so yeah, Caroline's completely right. The coherence thing is quite important. There are so many initiatives rushing forward which have loads of good bits in. They do need to tie up. So the taxonomy does talk about minimum social standards, but not in quite the same terms as the non-financial disclosure requirement talks about them, etc., etc. I'm sure all these things will be ironed out, but it is quite important. Otherwise, you lose a lot of people in the confusion between some of those things. And I would also say that there's a bit of an error going on, which is assuming that all you need is companies publishing the right information on one hand and investors doing the right thing at the other end. And one of my other roles is remaining as an advisor to Vigeo Eiris, one of the ESG rating agencies, now part of Moody's. And I think we need to recognize the importance of that middle bit. Felicitas would know this well from Know the Chain, and I know it from CHRB, you know, taking what companies produce and turning it into something that investors could use to push in one direction or another. That's a hugely important function in the process. And I do see people talking about it as though the only problem is to get companies to produce the right data and then investors can do everything. So I would say, yeah, coherence, and think about that middle bit of the sandwich where the analysis is going on, and look at how you can encourage more and better analysis to take place.
Thank you. Yes, coherence, I think, came up a number of times in today's event. And also this connects well with what David was saying at the beginning of this panel about the dual role that investors have. So great. I will now really want to invite Andreas Jacobs to give a few closing remarks. He is he works for the permanent representation of the Federal Republic of Germany to the European Union, and is the current chair of the Council Working Party for Development Cooperation, CODEF. And CODEF actually handles general aspects of development cooperation policy, contributing to the objective of poverty eradication. So Andreas, you have 5 or 4 minutes now before we close the event. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Thanks very much. I'll try to do it in 5. And please bear with me a little bit, because what I'm trying to do is to zoom back, or like zoom out of the super interesting details that we have heard. And I might miss some details, but I'm trying to put some spotlights. So bear with me. As German presidency of the Council, first of all, of the member states, first of all, let me emphasize the good thing is, or the bad thing is, it's only 6 weeks and then our presidency is over. The good thing is the Portuguese and Slovenian, our trio partners, will keep the agenda up. So the business and human rights agenda will also be something very prominently that our colleagues are pushing forward, as do many member states already. So that's a Council perspective. Now, speaking also for the Council, just as a preview, colleagues are currently working on Council conclusions for our ministers on human rights and decent work in global supply chains, where you find the Council position on many of the issues we were talking about today. And that will be published probably on the 3rd of December. So it could be something to look into to see where member states stand. 2 important elements to highlight, and then I'll dive into our debate. Just from the Council side, it's clear to all member states that we need an ambitious EU action plan on business and human rights, implementation, social and environmental standards, and transparency. And we need, and that's also very clear, and the Council will probably say it like this, we need a smart mix of measures. So this clever mix of mandatory, voluntary, national, international measures, as is recommended by so many actors. And I think there's no way around it. It makes a lot of sense if it's really about respecting human rights and strong social and environmental standards. So speaking as Germany then, and as a development cooperation chair and delegate, I really want to express that we highlight and we welcome very much the initiative by Commissioner Reinders, DG Just, on the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative. We're super happy to see that in the Commission's work program for 2021, including due diligence legislation. And the normative reference points mentioned so many times already in our debates and also today is, of course, the UN guiding principles and the OECD sector-specific guidelines. I mean, that's where we all convene in the end. The question is how it actually looks like. And now if you look at different member states, all of you know that there's national due diligence legislations of different kinds in France, the Netherlands. Many member states are working on it, Germany included. And I will not bore you to death why this is needed. You all know it much better. But I think one argument that was mentioned before is super important for us. I mean, we need a level playing field. As a common market, that's a key argument for businesses, and it's a key argument meant for lawmakers as well, and other actors, NGOs included. We need harmonization in this field of the common market as we need it, and we have it in many other fields. So I think clear push from the council side. How it looks like in the end exactly, I think it's something that will keep us busy. And now let's dive in. When we talk about sustainable finance, corporate reporting, what we absolutely heard, and it's I think the key and core message that I take out of our debate is this is so much linked to each other that coherence and alignment is key, right? Otherwise we'll never have effective implementation and we'll never have results on the ground. And sometimes, at least in our Brussels bubble, it's very good to be reminded, as some of you did today, that in the end, it's about first changing behavior of economic actors, but also of others, and then creating impacts in people's lives. And these should be real and perceived as positive by the people themselves. So that's down the line. And it takes a lot of years, I would even guess, in our policy making to get there, but we can, and the train is moving on member state sides as well. So just to spotlight, sustainable finance is key, and to find coherence, regulation there to actually promote economic growth and protect the environment, business and human rights, etc. We absolutely see, and here is Germany speaking, but it's a view of very many member states, that the recently published EU taxonomy is a key step forward. We also heard in our debate from different angles that yes, but you actually need transparent data, you need good reporting. I mean, we've had voluntary reporting for a long time in different ways. We had the tick the box thing. All of these means have good points to it, but there's always things you can make better. And the taxonomy regulation is a stepping stone forward, and we see that. But in the end, of course, it's businesses reporting according to ESG criteria, and how they do it is fundamental to how we see the world. Now we can act on it, and that be all state and non-state actors. More generally, I like I think the dual role David called it. So very strong key message when you look at the financial sector and investors. That's a bit, you can make it an academic argument, but I mean, first, the investors play a huge role in as they incentivize and push actual companies and businesses to further protect human rights, right? They're norm co-creators, they're standard setters, they're norm promoters as investors, because companies take money and it comes with conditions or not. And that is linked then to who sets the standards together with the financial sector or for the financial sectors. So that's the one thing, but in a double sense, of course, just to emphasize that from the debate, investors are also businesses in their own rights, right? So they don't just have leverage, but they also have a responsibility to protect, to remedy, etc., etc. And I think that goes hand in hand, but not necessarily easily and not always. So we need to together push and work on these things to get it right, to get it complementarily and get it right. And then 3 more points and then I'm through. There were many, many, many other elements I heard in the debate, and I'm just highlighting some. We're talking about business climate boards and directors' role. That's very different in the EU already and worldwide as well. This idea of actually ensuring effective participation and actually ensuring effective remedy. I mean, sometimes it works, mostly it doesn't. And if it does, it's a long process. So that is difficult also for the EU to do, because affected groups might be far, far away. So these are elements, environmental standards, getting them in line with business and human rights ideas, etc. Tick the boxes and mindsets were things we heard, which are important, but maybe not enough, you have to see. So all of these things, even if the EU, and we're very much supporting the EU's and Commission's efforts, and also the Parliament's efforts to push, all of this will keep us busy in 2021. And that means the NGO community, the business community, and member states and the EU institutions. And we will need to, and that's another takeaway that I take out of the debate. So when it comes to the nitty-gritty details of getting things right and complementary in the next year on an EU level and oriented towards global norms, we need not to just pay attention. We need not just to look at expertise, but also check the practicability of what we do. Too complex things are sometimes very tricky, and we need to do that both for any kind of new regulatory, that is mandatory frameworks, but also looking at some kind of enhanced voluntary measures of all kinds. Sometimes they are actually really good, and as development cooperation delegate, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to have stakeholders come together and voluntarily agree and work capacity building wise with partners on the ground in different ways. So that's, I think, another key thing. Let's keep attention to the nitty-gritty details, and that says we as Germany, but again the Council and many other member states in different ways. We're working on these fields. We're getting things together with all of you, and we should really support together with all of you the EU's push and the Commission's push next year to get this right. And if it takes more than 1 year, fine, but we never should stop pushing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. That was an expert summary of the meeting today. And really, it's a bit of a shame that it's only 6 weeks left of your presidency, but let's hope that the next president can continue that drive and energy. So I will just to remind everybody that this session has been recorded. So if you want to share it with others or go back to what was said, you will be able to do so. Apologies if there were some questions or comments in the chat box that were left unanswered. We just didn't have time for that. But for example, a very good one came in recently from Tilman Massa about corporate engagement and transparency. But I'll encourage everybody to continue these conversations outside of the event. And lastly, really just to thank again all the panelists, all the moderators, all the participants for attending, as well as the 5 co-organizing organizations and the generous support of GIZ to make this event happen. So with that, I wish you a rest of the day wherever you are, and a good weekend. Thank you very much.